Welcome back to Footsies. This time we have part 2. Obviously, if you've not watched the first part, be sure to go and do that. So, recall that Baby Footsies is Footsies in its simplest form. So he said, well, what if we just had a fighting game that all it had was walking and attacking? And so now, in this video, I want to go over a different type of Footsies, and that is the Footsies that exist in a game with a few more mechanics added on top of just walking and attacking. Namely, they are the mechanics that exist in basically every fighting game that there is. So we're going to be talking about blocking, chip damage, three-way jumps, dashes, counter hits, the corner, life bars, and finally, pre-block. And we now have more than just one attack. We have several different buttons that have different ranges, different speeds, different recoveries, different advantages, etc, etc, etc. So let's recall what Footsies means. Footsies is the entire set of viable strategies that players can employ most often in order to try to win. So now that we've exited Baby Footsies, we now have several attacks. We even have special moves, we have invincible moves, we have fireballs with an infinite range, and we can jump, and we can crouch, do crouching moves, and we have special cancels, we have combos. So now that the game is more complex, we've thrown several wrenches into the previously pretty stable mind game of Baby Footsies. So where is our new starting point? Where do we start building Footsies from? Well, in Baby Footsies, we started with aggressive poking, because that was the most obvious strategy of just walking into range of your attack and then hitting it. But now that we have blocking, there's really no reason to just do this over and over again. I mean, we're getting nowhere here. So our new starting point is, well, what if my opponent is just crouch blocking the entire time? What do I do to deal damage to my opponent if they are just sitting there blocking? So there are 3 different ways to deal damage to an opponent who is blocking. The first of which is to do something that's not blockable, so throws. Although obviously the weakness of throws is their limited range. The second way to deal damage to a blocking opponent is to do a move that still deals damage even if it's blocked, like a special move. Now, in general, in most fighting games, it is not really feasible to construct an entire strategy based around little chips of damage like this. Although there are certain characters in certain fighting games that are very good at this, most of the time this is not feasible. And then you might be thinking, well, there's no other possible way to deal damage to a blocking opponent. Well, there actually is, and that is somehow tricking them into not blocking or fooling them into not blocking correctly. So we can use low attacks to force them to block low, overheads to force them to block high, and cross-ups to force them to block the other direction. Now, this is definitely something that you can build a strategy around, especially in certain games that have really good mix-ups combined with throws. But what about in Footsies? How do you do mix-ups in Footsies? I mean, technically, you could, walk forward to a range where you can cross them up, but just in general, jumping is not a good idea because you can get anti-aired because you can't block during jumps in most games. And most of the time, you're not going to be able to mix up between high and low from this far away. There are characters that have lows and overheads that reach this far in some games, but it's usually not feasible to build a strategy around that either. If you do have a character that has really good overheads and low mix-ups, you usually need to be, somewhere pretty close, which has the same weakness as throws having short range. So the question then becomes, well, how do I get into that range from Footsies? So what are our universal ways, our non-character specific ways of getting into range of throws? Well, if we want to move forward, we have walking, we have dashing, and we have jumping. Now, we've already talked about jumping, and we've also already talked about walking in the previous video, so let's very briefly talk about dashing. Now, in general, dashing is a slightly faster way to move than walking, but it's a lot riskier because you are completely vulnerable throughout its entire duration. But even though walking has no commitment to it, and you can block during any frame of it, dashing and walking in most games are fairly similar in how they're treated in Footsies. But since walking is safer and harder to punish and more precise, in general, gives you more control over your character more often, let's focus on walking. Alright, so now where do we stand? Well, what if my opponent just walks forward and throws me? That is now the all-powerful option. We don't have a counter to it yet. So what is the counter? Well, let's set the dummy to playback and see what happens. Oh look, I can hit her. Again, the weakness of throws is their limited range. Well, all your other attacks definitely don't have that range, especially this one. So the answer of how you stop an opponent from walking forward at you is by pressing buttons. or poking. And it's important to say that this beats all forms of walking, not just walking forward and throwing, because even just walking into this range is advantageous for the one walking there. Now you're probably thinking, well, how is that advantageous? Isn't it still even? Well, no, it's not even, because I know that I'm going to be in this range before my opponent does, because he has to react to the fact that I walked and I don't. I know before I even walk there that I'm going to be there. This means that if my opponent's sitting still and I'm the one walking forward, I don't need to think about throws when I'm here. I only need to think about throws when I'm in range of the throw. Whereas my opponent does need to think about throws when I'm here, because I can walk into throw range and throw him before he has time to react. Now wait a second. We've already talked about predictive poking in the previous video. Predictive poking comes from the concept that, well, if we're both in range of our attacks and we both hit the attack, well, who wins? It's the one who presses the button first. So if the opponent is walking forward into range of their attack, but I press my button first, I will win, because that's just how it works. If I hit my button first, I win. But notice it's a little bit different now, because we have to consider the range of the attacks that we're going for. If he's going for a walk-in throw, I have a million years from the time he enters my poke range to the time he gets to throw range, where I can press my button and still win. This makes it very easy and more consistent to land predictive poking, because the opponent is going to try to use more forward movement than normal. Either way, the way to beat walking forward and doing something is to predictively poke. And also from the first video, the way to beat predictive poking is by whiff punishing. And suddenly, we are back to where we started with baby footsies. Now, we've added more things to the game, but not a lot of them have come into play. The general strategy has remained mostly the same. And so, just like before, you can think of it as like a cycle of options where, walking will beat whiff punishing, which beats predictive poking, which beats walking. But also, just like before, it's a little bit more complicated than that, because you have to worry about human reaction time and the fact that every moment is not a snapshot that you can consider for an infinite amount of time. Because both players are constantly moving back and forth, you have a lot more to consider. So that's all the same. What's different? Well, what's changed is that you don't necessarily lose the game off of the opponent being here. If the opponent's here and you're like, oh, wow, they're standing there, in baby footsies, you've already lost, because they've already pressed their button and they've already won. But in an actual fighting game with blocking and with life bars, that's not the case, because you have to worry about mix-ups. And so now, we not only have to worry about winning the game, we have to worry about a scale of rewards and a scale of punishments, which make it more interesting to weigh the risks and rewards of different options. So let's go back and look at strategy 2, which was predictive poking. It still works, because walking forward is not blocking. You can't block while walking forward. But now that we have several different attacks with different properties, we have to sort of choose which button to press if we want to do a predictive poke. So if I set the dummy to walk forward and poke me, I can throw out a predictive poke like this to beat it. So then what makes for a good predictive poke? The number one thing that you have to think about when asking yourself that question is the startup of the move. Because if your move is too slow, it doesn't matter how far it goes or how much damage it does, because the opponent can just see it coming a mile away and defend against it properly. So somewhere around 20 frames startup is what you're looking for something that is even a contender for a poke. Although keep in mind that there are moves that are plus on block. So even if they block it, it's possible that you want them to block it. And in that case, it's not a matter of simply can they block it on reaction or not, it's can they counter it on reaction. But even for pokes that are under that 20 frame threshold, it's a good idea to use faster ones rather than slower ones, because slower pokes require more anticipation than faster pokes. You also have to consider how many active frames a move has, because if you're a little bit early, they might still walk into a later active frame. So those are the things that make a poke more consistent to land. You also have to consider the rewards if it works, and also the punishment when it doesn't work. So what are the things that make a poke more rewarding? Well, we're looking for damage, so obviously a poke that deals more damage is probably better than a poke that deals less damage. However, you also have to consider pokes that are cancelable into special moves or are otherwise able to start a combo. And as far as how safe and punishable a move is, you obviously need to consider, frame advantage, how bad is it on block. You also need to consider its total number of whiff frames. How long are you stuck in this animation before you're allowed to block again? And you also need to consider how your hurt box moves during the attack animation, because an attack like this is quick and retracts quickly, whereas an attack like this, while it has better range and knocks down on hit, your leg is out there for a very long time, therefore it is much easier for the opponent to get a whiff punish. The timing window for them to get a whiff punish from further away is much greater. Now there's a very common technique that you can employ here, and that is to buffer your attack. So if your move is cancelable on hit, but not on whiff, you are able to input it the same way every time, but if they happen to walk into it, it'll automatically option select and do the move for you, or if it doesn't hit, it won't. This is important because most special moves are unsafe on block, such as this one. And this works because if you just do your poke from outside of its range in anticipation of them walking into it, there's really no way for them to block it. They have to move forward to get into range, but they can't move forward and block at the same time. So if you're doing predictive pokes, or pokes from outside their range, you get to consider more special move cancel options than if you were already in range and doing them as an aggressive poke. So once again, a good consistent poke will have good range, startup, and active frames. A poke with good reward will have high damage or otherwise confirmable into a combo. And a safe poke will have a quick whiffing animation, quick hurt box retraction after the active frames are over, and will be safe on block at its tip range. Now let's move on to Whiff Punishment. So same recording, but this time I'm walking backwards to make the attack whiff. The number one thing that is different now than it was in Baby Footsies is the idea of pre-blocking animations. Whenever I start to attack and my opponent is holding back to block, instead of walking backwards, their characters will put up their arms in a blocking stance. This prevents them from moving backwards, which makes it more difficult to whiff punish, even for really slow attacks. Like that one. They are stuck in that pre-blocking animation. Now, the way the game handles pre-blocking is a little bit different from game to game, but for the most part, it is as soon as I start an attack and you are in range of the pre-block. So what does this mean for Footsies? Well, it means that if the opponent is going to whiff punish you, the startup of your attack is less important. This is because even if my attack has a billion startup frames and you try to walk backwards while you're in range of it, that doesn't matter. It's going to keep you there. You can't walk backwards. So instead, you have to play around with your opponent's reaction time and already be out of range of the attack when they hit the button. So what makes a consistent Whiff Punisher? Well, it has to do with the hit regions or the hitbox of the attack. So for example, this attack hits pretty high up, whereas this attack hits low to the ground. But then you consider an attack like this, which is a little bit off the ground, but it's not terribly high off the ground. And so the goal here is to predict which poke they're going to do, and then choose a Whiff Punisher that has a hitbox somewhere that overlaps with the hurtbox of that move. So, in the case of Chun-Li's sweep, I need to do an attack that hits low to the ground. Now, as you can see here, it's very important that you go into training mode and you test this, because even though it looks like this should be whiff punishing her, it's not. So take the time to go into training mode, figure out which of your opponent characters' poke are troublesome, and figure out which of your whiff punish tools are the most consistent against all of your opponent's poking tools at all ranges. And then, when you get into a game, pay close attention to your range, and pay close attention to which pokes your opponent wants to use, and then think to yourself, in advance, what buttons you need to press in order to whiff punish. So then, what makes a rewarding whiff punisher? Well, obviously, you have to consider how much damage it deals, but especially for whiff punishers, since they usually have shorter range, they have other benefits that make them stronger, such as cancelability into far-reaching special moves. And finally, what makes a safe Whiff Punisher? The number one thing is short active frames and short hurt boxes, just like Predictive Poking. And in fact, if you think about it, Predictive Poking and Whiff Punishing are very similar. In fact, you can even use the same moves to poke that you do to Whiff Punish. Although, ironically, attacks that tend to be good at Whiff Punishing good pokes are also easily Whiff Punished by those same pokes. If anything, these two strategies counter each other depending on the timing of the attacks. It's not as simple as rock, paper, scissors. More precisely, attacking first wins if you are in range of that attack, whereas attacking later wins if the opponent was not in range of their attack. Now, it should be said that for Whiff Punishing, reaction is possible if the attack is extremely slow, but most of the time, it's not possible to be like, oh, did you just do standing heavy punch? I better Whiff Punish you with this move. That's usually not possible. Most of the time, you need to be constantly reacting to the situation of the game, not necessarily which attack the opponent is doing. So for example, if Seth is right here, he really wants to throw Heavy Punch because it's really good at this range. Which means that as a Chun-Li player, you should be thinking, I better walk backwards so that his attack whiffs. And that way you're ready for it to whiff and you can Whiff Punish it. So this is not reaction, it's not prediction, it's both reaction and prediction, which is awareness, or continuous reaction to the situation. You are ready for that range when it occurs, and you are able to execute by walking backwards and Whiff Punishing with whatever poke Whiff punishes Seth stand hard punch. And so now we have evolved from Baby Footsies, which was just pick one of these three options and do it, to you have several buttons that can all be used in various ways, and you have two main ways of countering the opponent's aggression. Which one will you choose, and which move will you choose to do that? In general, Predictive Poking, or poking in anticipation of the opponent running into your attack, is more rewarding and easier and more consistent than Whiff Punishing, but is also riskier if it doesn't work because you can get Whiff Punished by it. And Whiff Punishing is less risky because, well, what's the risk of doing short-range attacks from far away that recover quickly? But it's a lot harder to Whiff Punish because of pre-blocking, and because you actually have to predict not only when the opponent attacks, but also which attack they do, which is that hit region thing that I was talking about. Whereas if you're predictively poking, you don't really care what attack they're doing, you just care about when they move forward to do the attack. But in that sense, Whiff Punishing happens later than Predictive Poking. Whiff Punishing requires more of a read on which attack they do, and less about when they do it, because you can sort of react to them doing the attack. If you're reacting to them doing an attack when predictively poking, you're too late, because you have to do your attack before theirs, whereas Whiff Punishment takes place after their attack is already missed. So that's the absolute basics of common footsies. Let's finish up common footsies by talking about some of the other mechanics that are very common. The first of which being the edge of the stage, or the wall. Now obviously when your back is to the wall, you can't backwalk anymore, or you can, but you don't go anywhere. This means it's very easy for the opponent to not whiff their attacks. I can just stand in range of the attack, not worry about it whiffing because you can't move backward anymore. This makes Whiff Punishment much less viable, which sort of forces you to take more of a risk by going for a defensive poke or a predictive poke. This also increases the reward for certain characters because of corner-only combos, like that one. And just in general, it makes it very easy for the opponent to think about everything at once, such as anti-air, because they don't have to worry about getting Whiff Punished anymore. In fact, it's a very common strategy, especially in Street Fighter games, to sort of sit here at the perfect range to anti-air, and occasionally walk forward and poke, or otherwise wait for the opponent to try to move forward and then punish them for it. And likewise, if you're the one in the corner, you should be looking for ways to get out of the corner. Next, let's talk about counter hits. So what a counter hit is when you do an attack and the opponent does an attack and you hit them during the startup animation of their attack. Now, depending on the game and the character and the specific attack you're doing, you'll get different rewards for counter hitting the opponent. But for the most part, you get more damage and sometimes greater hit stun, which allows more combo opportunities where they wouldn't be even possible without a counter hit. So how does this apply to footsies? Well, it's very important to know that Whiff Punishing doesn't usually give you a counter hit because you're hitting the opponent after their attack's already missed, whereas predictive poking might land a counter hit because you're doing your attack before they do their attack. Next is the idea of low attacks, or attacks that can't be blocked while walking backwards. This is important because the opponent can't walk backwards to block anymore. Normally, if you're in range of a poke and you want to whiff punish, but you're a little too close, you'll just block the attack because you're holding back to block. But if he goes for a low poke, you actually get hit instead. So this is very important to consider low attacks when you're in range of them and the opponent is trying to whiff punish by walking backwards. And the last thing that I wanted to talk about is the concept of anti-air. Anti-air is very important in Footsies because jump attacks are an instantaneous way to leave Footsies. And who leaves Footsies on top depends on whether or not you anti-air. If you anti-air, you get the advantage. If you don't anti-air, you are now losing because they have frame advantage now. Now, there are several game-specific factors that go into anti-air. For example, air blocking, double jumps, air dashes, dive kicks, or any move that alters your jump trajectory, or a game like KOF, which has several different possible jump arcs to choose from. All these things make it more difficult to anti-air. So as a player playing Footsies, it's important to know which ones you can react to raw, which ones you need to anticipate very strongly and think about at the forefront of your mind during Footsies, and also which ones you can't react to and you need to have anticipation and predict them. You also need to know the difference in reward if you do score the anti-air, knowing which attacks do little damage and which attacks do a lot of damage. And finally, you need to know which of your attacks are quick enough to where if the opponent does manage to go over it with a jump, you can still anti-air in time, and which attacks are slow and riskier to jumps because a jump might even punish it. The most common example of that is a fireball, which is a great poke because it travels forever. It goes across the entire screen. It's safe on block. It does chip damage on block, and it's disjointed from the player, so it's very difficult to whiff punish. So what's the main way to deal with fireballs? It's to jump. And that is the end of common Footsies. And just to reiterate, this is not the actual Footsies that you're playing in a match, although it's probably very similar, depending on how simple the game is to play. And so you need to take all of these concepts and merge them with the game you're playing and ask yourself, how do these mechanics in this game that I'm playing affect the mind games, affect the viable strategies that go on in common Footsies? How has this changed the way I need to think? And once you do that, you are on the road to learning Footsies. Actual Footsies. And so, part 3 of Footsies, we'll be going over actual Footsies, except not really, because it's impossible to make one video that covers actual Footsies, because Footsies change so drastically from game to game, and even if I were to stick with one game, I would need to consider Footsies for every single matchup. And even if I made a video for every single matchup and every single fighting game, it's still too much to talk about in just one video. And so this is a series that is forever unfinished. Although, in the coming days, weeks, months, years, maybe even decades, I will continue to learn fighting games, to understand what I'm learning, and to try to articulate the things that I understand about what I've learned about fighting games. If you would like alerts to when I do any of this, to when I write a guide, or when I upload a video, or when I start streaming, be sure to join my Discord channel, because every single time I do basically anything, I'm in there posting an announcement detailing exactly what I've done. Or if you just want to hang out and chat or discuss something with me, I'm also in there ready to respond almost 24/7, except when I sleep. It is by far the quickest and most consistent way to contact me. So with all that out of the way, we're done with this video. I hope you learned something from it. I know I certainly learned something from making it and writing the script, but now that it's over, I can finally uninstall this game again.